The moment Caspian Delacroix walked into the faculty lounge on a Tuesday morning with coffee staining his white collar and chalk dust smearing his left cheekbone, Theron Vasiliev felt the exact second his carefully constructed world tilted on its axis and never tilted back. He had spent 11 years building a life of perfect academic composure, tenure, published papers, a reputation for untouchable brilliance, and now it was all unraveling because a stranger had terrible coffee habits and beautiful, reckless eyes that seemed to dare the entire universe to look away. Theron looked away. He looked away 3 times, counted the ceiling tiles, and looked back anyway. Because some disasters are worth every consequence they carry. Caspian did not notice him at first. That was, perhaps, the most devastating part. He moved through the lounge with the easy carelessness of a man entirely comfortable inside his own mind, dropping his leather satchel onto the counter with a thud that made the coffee mugs rattle, pulling open the cabinet above the sink as though he had been doing it his whole life, and muttering something under his breath in what Theron would later learn was a mixture of French and Russian that did not entirely belong to either language. He was tall in the way that felt accidental, as though his body had simply decided to keep going one morning and nobody had stopped it, with dark hair that curled at the temples from what must have been a habit of running damp hands through. His jacket was slightly too large at the shoulders and slightly too short at the wrists, and Theron, who had spent his career studying the literature of desire, had never in his life understood the phrase undone by a detail until this particular Tuesday morning. "You're staring," said Caspian, without turning around. Theron opened his mouth, closed it, and decided that the most dignified response was to pretend he had been examining the bulletin board behind Caspian's left shoulder, which bore a flyer for a campus blood drive that had taken place 6 weeks ago. He picked up his coffee mug with the careful precision of a man who was absolutely not staring and absolutely not feeling his pulse behave in a manner inconsistent with his age, his education, or his general philosophy of emotional restraint. "I was reading the notice board," he said, and the words came out in the particular flat tone of someone who knows they have already lost an argument. Caspian turned then, and the full impact of his face in direct light was Theron would never find the right word for it. Not handsome in the way that photographs could capture. Handsome in the way that weather is handsome, changeable and immediate and impossible to hold. He had a jaw that seemed to be in permanent argument with the rest of his expression, and eyes the color of river water in early autumn, and a mouth that curved in a way that suggested he was perpetually on the verge of saying something that would completely rearrange your afternoon. "The blood drive," he said, reading the flyer, "was in October." He looked at Theron. "It's January." "I'm aware of that," said Theron. "Then what were you reading?" "The typography," said Theron, and for one extraordinary moment it appeared that Caspian Delacroix was going to laugh, a real laugh, not the polished social kind, but he restrained it, pressing his lips together in the manner of a man who has decided that laughing at a stranger this early in the morning might be considered impolite. He extended his hand instead, across the counter between them, and said, "Caspian Delacroix. Comparative literature. I start Monday. Well, I started Monday, technically. But orientation ran long and I missed the faculty meeting, and I've been told by approximately 4 different people that this is already a bad sign." Theron shook his hand. It was a mistake. Not because the handshake was unusual in any measurable way. It lasted the standard duration, exerted the standard pressure, but because contact has a way of confirming things that distance allows. You too, Denis, and Theron's hand registered the warmth of Caspian's with a clarity that bypassed every sensible thing he believed about himself. "Theron Vasiliev," he said, Russian literature. I've been here 11 years. And you still read outdated blood drive flyers, said Caspian, releasing his hand. Only the interesting ones, said Theron, and Caspian did laugh then, and it was exactly as disruptive as Theron had suspected it would be. That was the beginning. It was not, at first, anything Theron could name. He had spent enough years studying the architecture of human feeling, pulling it apart in Tolstoy and Turgenev and Dostoevsky, to know that the most dangerous emotions are the ones that do not announce themselves as such. They arrive disguised as small inconveniences. A colleague whose office is 3 doors down your hall, a shared lunch table and a faculty lounge that is just slightly too small. A habit of stopping the talk that begins as courtesy and becomes, without anyone deciding that it has, necessity. By the end of January, Theron knew that Caspian drank his coffee with an extraordinary amount of sugar that was at odds with every other ascetic quality he possessed. He knew that Caspian had grown up in Lyon with a Russian-French mother who taught piano and an Algerian father who taught mathematics, and that this combination had produced in him a person who moved through the world as though it were a text. He was in the process of annotating. He knew that Caspian wrote his lecture notes in 3 colors of ink and kept a notebook covered in a fabric that had once been a curtain in his grandmother's house. He knew all of this the way you know the geography of a place you visit daily without ever quite deciding to memorize it, not deliberately, but completely. What Theron did not know, and spent considerable effort not examining, was why this knowledge felt essential in a way that knowledge about other colleagues, equally interesting people, some of them did not. It was Caspian who brought it closest to the surface first, though not intentionally. They were in the library in the 2nd week of February, occupying opposite ends of a long reading table in the way that 2 people who sit near each other out of habit frame as coincidence. And Caspian was reading something that was making him. Theron could tell because the furrow between his brows deepened with each page, and he kept turning back as though searching for the moment the text had offended him. Theron was supposed to be grading papers. He graded 3 in 40 minutes, which was a rate he would find embarrassing later. "What are you reading?" he finally asked, because it seemed safer than continuing to pretend he was not watching Caspian. Red Caspian looked up. His expression cleared in the way it always did when he transitioned from internal conversation to external. A kind of refocusing that Theron had noticed was uniquely his. Most people smoothed their faces blank, but Caspian simply shifted his intensity from the page to the person in front of him. And the effect was disconcerting because it felt like being looked at rather than looked toward. "Proust," he said. "Volume 3. I'm teaching it next semester and I'm trying to remember why I love it, and all I can find right now is why it infuriates me. Because the narrator is so comprehensively self-deceived," said Theron. Caspian stared at him. "Yes," he said, slowly. "Exactly that. He knows everything and understands nothing, and the gap between those 2 things is the whole architecture of the novel. It's also," said Theron, "the most honest thing about it. Self-deception isn't stupidity. It's a form of self-preservation. The narrator knows on some level what the truth is, and he constructs an entire brilliant edifice to keep from having to live inside it." There was a silence. Caspian set the book down. "You've thought about this," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a question. "I'll teach literature," said Theron. "It's an occupational hazard." "I don't mean Proust," said Caspian, and then he seemed to catch himself, and picked the book back up, and said, "Never mind. You're right about the self-deception. I think that's the key to the whole section." And they returned to their respective work, and Theron graded 7 more papers in 15 minutes, with a concentrated focus of a man actively refusing to think about something, March arrived the way it always does in this part of the country, with false promises of warmth and then gray skies that felt personal. Theron and Caspian had developed, without discussing it, a set of habits that a neutral observer might have catalogued as friendship, and that Theron was beginning, with growing unease, to suspect was something else. They walked across campus together after the Tuesday faculty seminar, which Caspian attended with visible ambivalence, and Theron attended with visible resignation, and they had taken to stopping at the stone bench near the old oak tree in the central quad where the path divided one direction toward the Humanities building, one toward the parking lot, and talking for longer than was technically necessary before going their separate ways. They talked about their students, their research, the particular way institutional life had of making you feel simultaneously indispensable and invisible. They talked about books, the way other people talk about old friends, with specific grievances and deep loyalties. They talked, sometimes, about no thing at all, in the way that requires a certain level of comfort to sustain. It was on one of these evenings, with the last of the daylight turning the old stone buildings amber and the temperature dropping in the specific way that makes a coat feel insufficient, that Caspian said something that Theron later marked as the moment the shape of everything changed. They had been talking about Turgenev, Theron's specialty, Caspian's self-described blind spot, and Theron had been explaining the particular quality of longing that runs through fathers and sons like a current through cold water, and Caspian had been listening with that full, crescent attention, but it was one of the things about him that was genuinely alarming, and he said, "You talk about longing like someone who has practiced it." Theron stopped speaking. The campus sounds continued around them, distant voices, the mechanical thud of a door, a bicycle wheel on gravel, and the silence between them was the particular kind that has weight. "I teach it," he said, after a moment. "You teach it," Caspian repeated, and his voice was gentle in a way that made the gentleness worse. "But you talk about it the way I talk about exile, like a country you know from the inside." Theron looked at him for a long moment. The amber light was doing something unfair to Caspian's face, softening it in some places and sharpening it in others, finding the exact quality of his expression. That made him look like someone in a painting that was aware it was being looked at. "What do you know about exile?" Theron asked, because it was safer than responding to what Caspian had actually said. "My mother left Russia before I was born," said Caspian. "Not politically for love, initially, and then because she realized that love was not a country and you can't live in it, you can only visit and return to what you actually are." He paused. "She used to say that the loneliest thing is not being far from home. It's not knowing what home is supposed to feel like." In the first place, Theron said nothing for what was probably too long. The bench was cold beneath him, and the oak tree above them was still leafless, its branches making a complicated dark pattern against the fading sky, and Caspian was 3 feet away and felt closer than that in some way that was not physical. "That's a very Russian sentiment," Theron said at last, "for a woman who left." Caspian smiled. "She was a very Russian woman," he said, "in every way that mattered." He stood, picking up his satchel, and the moment, whatever it had been, shifted into the ordinary. "Same time Thursday," he said, and Theron nodded, and they went their separate ways. And Theron sat in his car in the parking lot for 4 minutes before starting the engine, which was long enough to understand, with the clarity that comes just before denial closes back over a thing, that he was in serious trouble. He told himself it was admiration. He had enormous respect for Caspian's mind, which was real. It was genuinely one of the best he had encountered in a career spent among good minds, wide-ranging and precise at once, capable of moving from the specific to the general and back, again with the ease of someone for whom intellectual categories had never been walls. He told himself it was the natural intensity of an intellectual friendship, that this was how literary people related to each other, with the kind of attentiveness that other fields reserved for data. He told himself, several times, that he was 51 years old and had spent 30 of those years in a quiet, private understanding of himself that had simply never required naming because nothing had ever made it relevant to name. He had not been unhappy. He had been, he searched for the word sufficient. His life had been sufficient. The problem with Caspian Delacroix was that he made sufficiency feel like a very small room. It was a Friday in late March when something shifted enough that Theron could no longer maintain the architecture of his explanations. They had been in Caspian's office, a small, perpetually disorganized space that Caspian had filled in 3 months with the accumulated evidence of every intellectual interest he had ever had, books stacked in patterns that appeared random, and probably were not, photographs pinned to the corkboard that mixed family snapshots with postcard reproductions of paintings and a hand-drawn map of some European river system whose label Theron had never been close enough to read. Theron had come to return a book. Caspian had lent him a collection of essays on translation that turned out to be extraordinary, and it stayed because the conversation that started when he handed over the book had no natural stopping. At some point, the corridor outside had gone quiet, which meant the building had mostly emptied for the weekend, and the light outside Caspian's single window had shifted from afternoon to early evening without either of them particularly noticing. Caspian was sitting on the edge of his desk, one leg hooked over the corner, and Theron was in the chair across from it, and they were arguing gently, in the manner of people who argue because they enjoy it rather than because they need to, about whether translation is an act of fidelity or an act of reinvention. Theron had taken the position that fidelity was the necessary constraint, that the translator's task was to disappear into the service of the original. Caspian thought this was philosophically incoherent, and said so with the cheerful directness that Theron had come to realize was his native register. "You can't disappear into a text," Caspian said. "You bring yourself whether you intend to or not. Every choice is self-expression. You just don't always know whose self is expressing what. That sounds like a justification for doing whatever." "You want?" said Theron. "It sounds like an honest description of what actually happens," said Caspian. "The question isn't whether you bring yourself. You always do. The question is whether you're honest about it." Theron looked at him, and the argument they were ostensibly having seemed suddenly to be made of different material than he had thought. "And if honesty is complicated," he said. Caspian was very still for a moment. He had that quality sometimes, of becoming suddenly precise in his stillness, as though everything peripheral fell away and only the essential thing remained. "Complicated how?" he said, and his voice was careful, not cautious, exactly, but calibrated, attending to something specific. Theron looked at the floor, at the stacks of books, at the map on the corkboard, anywhere that was not Caspian's river water eyes, in the particular slant of the evening light, in the way that knowing something, he said, and stopped. Started again. "There are things you can know for a very long time," he said, "and still not know how to say." The silence that followed was unlike any of their previous silences. It had a different quality, the quality, Theron thought, of two people standing at a door, and both knowing the door exists, without either one having agreed to open it. He heard Caspian exhale not quite a sigh, not quite a breath, something in between. "Yes," said Caspian, quietly, "I know that kind." Theron looked up then, because the quality of those 3 words had shifted the air in the room in a way. He could not pretend not to feel. Caspian was looking at him directly, which was not unusual. He looked at things directly as a general practice, but the quality of it was different now, stripped of the light scholarly deflection that usually edged their exchanges. Just direct, steady, and something in it that matched with an exactness that felt almost violent. The thing Theron had been constructing explanations not to look at for 3 months. "Caspian," said Theron, and his own voice surprised him. Lower than he expected, slower. "You don't have to," said Caspian. Not helpfully, not as an exit, as a statement of fact. "But you can." They sat with that for a moment that lasted some unmeasurable time. Outside, a bird passed the window, a quick, dark shape against the great pink sky. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. "I haven't." Theron started, stopped, tried again. "I'm not accustomed to being seen," said Caspian. The word landed somewhere in Theron's chest with an accuracy that took the breath out of him. "No," he said, after a moment. "Not that. I see you," said Caspian, simply, without drama, without flourish. "The way you state a fact that is both obvious and important. I have been, for 3 months, seeing you, and I think I'm fairly certain that you have been seeing me too. And I think we have both been doing what intelligent people do with things that are inconvenient, which is to read around them instead of reading them." Theron was quiet for a long time. The office felt small in a way it hadn't before, and warm, and extraordinarily still. "I'm 51 years old," he said, finally. "No," said Caspian. "I'm 43. We're both adults who have managed, by various mechanisms, to arrive at middle age with significant gaps in our self-knowledge. It happens." This is Theron searched for the word. "I don't have language for this. You have language for everything," said Caspian, gently. "You're choosing not to use it." Theron looked at him, really looked, the way he had been avoiding for 3 months. The way you look at a thing when you have decided to stop pretending you do not want to look. Caspian on the edge of his desk in the late Friday light, with his too-long jacket and his river-water eyes, and his face that was made entirely of presence and particularity, and the stillness of a person who is waiting, not for an answer, but for someone to finish arriving. "I think," said Theron, very slowly, "that I may have spent 30 years being very carefully beside a point." Caspian smiled. It was not the sharp, quick smile Theron had catalogued over the months. It was something softer, something that had been waiting behind the others. "Well," he said, "here's the point, if that's useful. They did not kiss that evening. What happened was perhaps more consequential. They talked for another 2 hours, in the way they had always talked, but with the door open now, with all the things that had been circling the edges of their conversations allowed to come into the center of them. Caspian talked about Lion, about growing up understanding he was different in some way that did not have a vocabulary where he was, about moving to Paris for university and finding the vocabulary and spending his 20s learning what to do with it, in his 30s building a life around it that was honest if not always comfortable. Theron talked about Minsk, about the particular Soviet-era weight of expectation and silence, about coming to this country for his doctorate and realizing, with a clarity he had not been prepared for, that certain kinds of freedom were both available and terrifying, about choosing, somewhere in his late 20s, a life that was simply clean, manageable, about the gap between that choice and happiness, which he had spent years declining to examine. When they finally left the building, Caspian locking, his office with the concentrated focus of someone who has just emerged from a conversation that has shifted the ground under their feet. The campus was dark and nearly empty. They walked to the parking lot together, and at the place where their cars were parked near each other by the low wall of the Humanities building, they stopped, and Caspian said, "Same time Thursday?" "Yes," said Theron. And then, because something had changed, and denying that it had changed would have been the exact kind of self-deception. They had just spent 2 hours dismantling, and perhaps something different on Saturday. Caspian looked at him. "Dinner," he said. "Dinner," said Theron. Caspian nodded. And then he did something Theron was not expecting. He reached out, and very briefly, very lightly, touched Theron's hand where it rested on the wall between them. Not a handshake, not anything that could be categorized, just a moment of contact, a brief and deliberate acknowledgement. Then he stepped back and picked up his satchel and said goodnight and walked to his car, and Theron stood at the wall for a moment with the warmth of it still in his fingers, and thought with absolute certainty that he was going to be completely destroyed by this man, and felt something that had been held tightly inside him for 30 years quietly begin to open. Saturday dinner was at a small Italian restaurant across the city from the university, not close enough to be convenient, far enough to feel like a choice. Caspian had suggested it, and Theron had agreed immediately, which told him something about how thoroughly his own careful habits had already been rearranged. The restaurant was warm and dim, the kind of place that understands that good food requires atmosphere, and that atmosphere requires a certain willingness to let the evening last as long as it wants. They arrived separately, as if by unspoken agreement, not secretively, not with anything as dramatic as subterfuge, but with the understanding that this was new territory, and new territory is best approached with some deliberateness. Caspian was already there when Theron arrived, sitting at a corner table with his coat still on and a glass of water in front of him and a look on his face that Theron would later call his translation look. The expression of someone who was reading a situation from one language into another. When he saw Theron, his face changed in that way it always did, the shift from internal to external that felt like being handed something. "You wore a different jacket," said Caspian. Theron sat down. "You notice my jackets?" "I've noticed your jackets for 3 months," said Caspian. "The gray one with the collar is your thinking jacket. The navy one is your teaching jacket. This one is?" He paused, looking at it. "This one I haven't seen before." "It's my dinner jacket," said Theron. Caspian picked up the menu. "I feel there is a meaning in that sentence," he said, "that I am choosing to receive without comment." They ordered wine and bread and things that neither of them would exactly remember later because the food was not the point. The point was the conversation, which was different from their other conversations, not in content, exactly, but in texture. More space in it. More willingness to let things sit without immediately being examined. Caspian told him about his first year in this city, a sabbatical fellowship 3 years ago that had become, through a series of small decisions, a permanent position. He talked about the difficulty of building a life somewhere that had not been planned. The particular dislocation of realizing you have built something real in a place you arrived in by accident. Theron told him about his grandmother, who had been a Dostoevsky scholar before the kind of life that being a Dostoevsky scholar in Soviet Russia entails, and who had told him when he left for America that the best thing he could do for the literature he loved was to be free enough to read it honestly. "She sounds extraordinary," said Caspian. "She was the most honest person I have ever known," said Theron. "She would have said things I have never said to anyone." Caspian looked at him over his wine glass. "What things?" that I spent 30 years being extremely well read about feelings I was not prepared to have," said Theron. Caspian set down his glass. "Theron," he said, and the way he said the name was different from how he usually said it, slower, more deliberate, as though he were handling something he knew was fragile. "Is this frightening for you?" The question was so direct and so unhidden that Theron felt something in him respond to it before his considered self could intervene. "Yes," he said, "in the specific way that finding out you have been afraid of something your entire adult life is frightening. Once you realize that what you have been calling other things was fear." "I was afraid for a long time too," said Caspian. "Different circumstances, different country, but the same shape, I think. The particular fear that comes from knowing something about yourself and not knowing whether the world you live in has room for it." He paused. "It took me until I was almost 32 to stop being afraid, and then I was furious at myself, mostly, for all the time." He smiled, and it was the rueful kind. "Wasted feeling. It doesn't help to be furious at yourself." "What helped?" asked Theron. "Exactly this, actually," said Caspian. "Someone sitting across from me who saw what I was and wasn't afraid of it." That sentence landed in the space between them with the particular weight of something that is offered rather than stated. Theron looked at him for a moment. This man, with his too large jacket and his grandmother's curtain-covered notebook and his river water eyes that were doing something extremely unfair in the candlelight. "I'm not afraid of what you are," said Theron, carefully. "I know," said Caspian. "I can tell. That's why I'm here." They walked after dinner, not back to their cars immediately, but through the streets, near the restaurant. In the particular latiming quiet of a city district that is relaxed into its own night rhythms. It was cold, a proper April cold. Nat had not yet decided to leave, and their breath made small shapes in the air between them. They were walking close together, close enough that their arms occasionally touched through their coats, and Theron was aware of this with a sensitivity that felt almost absurd. The brief press of sleeve against sleeve as they crossed a narrow street, the slight adjustment of trajectory that kept them close on a wide pavement. He was 51 years old and he was hyper-aware of an arm brush. It was, he supposed, one of the costs of being a late arrival to one's own life. They stopped at a small stone bridge over an urban creek, not dramatic, not particularly beautiful, just a place where the path paused and stood looking at the water below, which was dark and moving, picking up the streetlights in long, unsteady lines. Caspian was leaning on the railing, looking down, and Theron stood beside him. And after a moment Caspian said, without looking up, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You've been asking me personal questions for 4 months, said Theron. "More personal than usual," said Caspian. He looked up then, sideways, at Theron. "Have you been happy? In the life you built?" Theron considered the question with the respect it deserved. "I have been safe," he said, eventually. "Intellectually rich. Productive. Respected by people whose respect I value." He paused. "Happy as... I'm not sure I knew what that required." "Do you know now?" said Caspian. Theron looked at him. "I'm beginning to develop a theory," he said. Caspian turned toward him then. Pulley, the bridge railing behind him, and he was close enough that Theron could see the details of his face clearly in the streetlight, the line of his jaw, the slight asymmetry of his expression, the way his eyes held the light in 2 small steady points. "I would like to tell you something," said Caspian, "and I would like you to receive it without immediately putting it through the academic apparatus." "I'll try," said Theron. "I have been thinking about you," said Caspian, "since the first Tuesday morning. Not continuously, not obsessively, but with the specific frequency of someone who has decided that a thing is important. You are important, Theron. Not as a colleague, not as an intellectual. You are important in the way that changes how I read the morning and the afternoon and the evenings when I'm driving home and the space that used to be between Tuesday and Thursday. He stopped. That's what I wanted to say. The creek moved below them. A car passed on the street behind them. Theron looked at Caspian Delacroix in the streetlight and understood, with the terrible clarity of a person who has spent 30 years being a very good reader and is now reading himself for the first time, that this was the thing he had been afraid of and the thing he had wanted, and that those two facts had always been the same fact dressed in different clothes. He reached up, slowly, and touched Caspian's face, just his hand, to Caspian's jaw, the pad of his thumb against the line of his cheekbone, and said, "I have been thinking about you since the same Tuesday. I want you to know that." Caspian closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, which was the most undone Theron had ever seen him, and then he opened them and covered Theron's hand with his own hand on his jaw and said, quietly, "Okay?" And then he leaned forward, and Theron met him, and they kissed on the small, unbeautiful bridge over the urban creek. And it was nothing like the things Theron had spent 30 years reading about, and everything like all of them at once. They drove home separately that night, and Theron sat in his apartment, tidy, spare, the apartment of a man who has organized his environment to reflect a life that is under control, and felt the extraordinary strangeness of a person who has just become someone slightly different from the person who left the house. Not different in any way he could have pointed to. His books were the same books. His desk held the same papers. But there was something, some quantity of air in the room, some quality of the evening light through the window that was altered. He sat at his desk without turning on the lamp and thought about Caspian's face on the bridge and the warmth of his hand, and the particular courage it requires to say you are important to me without dressing it up in qualifications, and felt something that had lived in the back of him his entire life, quiet, contained, patient as bedrock, begin, finally, to move. He texted Caspian at 11:30. Not a long message. He was not, by temperament or training, a person who texted long messages. Just safe home. And then, after a pause, a second message. Thank you for this evening. Caspian's reply came in 4 minutes. Thank you for being worth coming home thinking about. Theron read the message twice, set down his phone, and went to bed, and slept better than he had in years. April settled into a rhythm. They were careful at the university, not in the way of people who are ashamed, but in the way of people who understand that new things are fragile and that the academic environment has particular social textures that do not always accommodate novelty gracefully. They continued their Tuesday walks across campus and their Thursday conversations by the oak tree and their shared table in the faculty lounge, and all of this continued to look, from the outside, exactly as it had before, to colleagues with a productive intellectual friendship, which was not an inaccurate description, just not a complete one. On Friday evenings, they went to dinner, or to the repertory cinema near Caspian's apartment, where they watched European films from the 1960s and argued about them in whispers, or to the small park behind the art museum where they walked, until the cold drove them to the coffee shop on the corner, which became, by the third visit, a coffee shop. The first time they were at the university together, and something shifted in a way that felt visible. It was entirely accidental. They were crossing the main courtyard on a Thursday afternoon when it began to rain, the sudden, emphatic kind of April rain that does not trouble with gradations. And they ran for the covered walkway that ran along the south side of the AI Humanities building, and they arrived at the same moment, both wet, both slightly breathless from the run, and Caspian looked at Theron and laughed. And Theron looked at Caspian and, for one moment, without considering the courtyard or the walkway, or the colleagues who might or might not be passing, put his hand against Caspian's wet arm and laughed too. And it was only afterwards, walking separately to their respective offices, that Theron registered the laughter as something that had happened in public, with his hand on Caspian's arm, and felt not exactly afraid but aware that the careful architecture he had built around his private life had a door in it that he had, possibly, left slightly open. Nothing came of that moment. Nobody appeared to have seen it, or if they had, nobody mentioned it. But it stayed with Theron, not as a warning, exactly, but as a reminder of a thing he had always known and was now knowing differently, that happiness is a form of visibility. That allowing yourself to feel things is allowing yourself to be seen feeling them. That the self-containment he had maintained for 30 years had served a function, and that the function was becoming less important than the thing it was containing. What was being contained, by May, was substantial. He had spent the weekend of the first Saturday in May in Caspian's apartment, a visit that had begun as dinner and become a conversation that went past midnight and then, slowly, by a process that felt both completely natural and entirely unprecedented, became something more. He was not going to narrate his own life the way he narrated literature, with analytical distance and structural clarity. What happened between them was private, in the way that the genuinely important things always are. But he would say this, that being known by another person, not seen, not admired, not respected, all of which had existed in his life before, but known, specifically and without reservation, was a different thing entirely. That Caspian knew how to make him feel, for the first time in his adult life, like the room he occupied was the right size for him. By June, they were spending more evenings together than apart. Caspian cooked, spectacularly, the kind of cooking that is simultaneously casual and ambitious, that treats dinner as an extension of thought rather than a necessity, and Theron brought wine and corrected student papers at the kitchen table, while Caspian worked at the counter, and they talked continuously, in the broken and reassembled way of two people who have stopped editing their thoughts before speaking them. Theron's apartment was becoming, quietly, a second version of Caspian's, a few books that migrated, a second coffee mug in the cabinet, a jacket hanging on the hook by the door that was slightly too large at the shoulders. They were not hiding. They were being careful, which is a different thing, though the line between them can be blurry. On campus, they maintained the same professional manner they always had, the same collegial ease that had characterized their relationship before. Family, the careful suppression that had previously accompanied it. What they did not do, deliberately, was perform their relationship in spaces that felt like tests. The faculty lounge was not a test. The courtyard was not a test. The seminar room where they occasionally attended each other's public lectures, Theron sitting 3 rows back from the front, Caspian in the second row when Theron's lecture series ran on alternate Thursdays, was not a test. But institutions have eyes that are not always eyes. And what those eyes see is processed in ways that are not always accurate. And the slow accumulation of visible things, the coffee cups left in each other's offices, the way their heads bent together over a shared text, the particular quality of their attention in each other's company that was different from their attention in the company of others, creates a picture even when no single piece of it is conclusive. Theron understood this, intellectually, with the clarity of a man who had read enough of human history to know that visibility has always been complicated for people like him. What he perhaps did not fully account for was how little he cared, anymore, set against what had been given to him on the other side of caring. It was Caspian who first said the word love. Not dramatically, Caspian did very few things dramatically, his intensity having the quality of depth rather than volume. They were in Theron's apartment on a Sunday evening in July, lying on the narrow sitting room floor because the evening had somehow ended up there, with Caspian's head on Theron's shoulder and Theron's hand in Caspian's hair and a playlist on the stereo that they had built together over 3 months of arguing about music. The light was the particular gold of summer evenings, when the sun is low and everything it touches seems to be made of something denser than usual amber, or honey, or the specific gravity of contentment. Caspian said, into the silence, without preamble, "I love you." I wanted to say it when I was thinking it rather than waiting for a better moment, because this moment is good enough. Theron was quiet for a moment. Caspian did not seem to need him to be not quiet. He had the patience of someone who has learned that silence is not always absence. Theron looked at the ceiling, at the last of the summer light on the white plaster, and felt the word moving through him with the particular quality of a thing that is finally in the place it was always supposed to go. "I love you," he said. And his voice surprised him again, not lower this time, but steadier than he expected, like someone who has finally put something down that they have been carrying for a long time. "I love you, and I want you to know that this is not something I have said before, and that is not because I was waiting for the right person. I was waiting for the right version of myself." Caspian lifted his head and looked at him. His expression was the softest thing Theron had ever seen on a person's face. "You should not have had to wait so long," he said. "No," said Theron. "But I have the time I have left, and that is enough." Caspian kissed him then, on the floor in the summer light, with the music playing softly and the whole astonishing, unrepeatable specificity of that particular evening around them, and Theron thought, for the second time since the bridge, that becoming someone slightly different from the person you have always been is the most frightening and the most necessary and the most extraordinary thing a human being is capable of. September brought the new academic year with its reliable chaos, new students, new schedules, the frenzy of the first weeks that made even experienced faculty feel like they were improvising. Caspian taught the seminars in a large lecture course in translation and received, within a week, the kind of student regard that comes from teaching with genuine passion. Theron's advanced seminar on 19th century Russian prose was full, for the first time in 6 years, which he chose not to overinterpret. They were busy in the separately consuming way of two people whose professional lives have genuine independent substance. And this was one of the things Theron valued most, that they came to each other from fullness, not from need. That what they gave each other was addition, not completion. Completion implied something missing. He had not been missing, exactly. He had been waiting to be found by someone who was looking with the right kind of attention. On campus, in September, they were less careful than they had been in April. Not reckless, but less careful. They had lunch together in the faculty dining room twice a week, which was not unusual for colleagues. But the quality of their attention at lunch was different from collegial attention, and some people noticed this without naming it, and some people named it without verifying it, and some people noticed and named it and decided it was irrelevant, which it was. Theron was aware that the department had opinions, had always had opinions, about everything, as departments do, and that some of those opinions were about him, specifically about the transformation in his demeanor that was visible even to people who did not know its source. He was less contained than he had been. He smiled differently, not more often, but more actually, the smile arriving from somewhere deeper than social reflex. He was quicker in conversation, more willing to be surprised. Multiple colleagues commented, in the oblique way academics favor, that he seemed well this autumn, and he said, each time, that it had been a good summer. One afternoon, in late September, they were in the main library together, sitting at their usual long table, as they had been since January when Theron looked up from his reading and found Caspian, looking at him with an expression that was so openly affectionate that it took his breath in a quiet way. There was no one else at the table. The library was not empty, but it was hushed, and the afternoon light came through the high windows and long horizontal planes, and Caspian was simply looking at him with the full and particular quality of his attention, with nothing hidden in it. Theron looked back. For a moment they were just looking at each other, in the library, in the afternoon, in the way that two people look when they have stopped pretending they do not want to look. Then Caspian smiled, a slow, private one, and looked back at his book, and Theron returned to his own reading with his face warm in a way. He was glad nobody could categorize. He was wrong that nobody was watching. He would learn this later, and it would matter enormously, and nothing about the learning of it would be fair. But for that moment, that particular autumn afternoon in the library, with the light coming in horizontally and Caspian 3 feet away, and the whole specific texture of that day, none of the future existed yet. There was only the present, which was, in that moment, enough. October deepened. The campus turned to the colors of its own postcards. The oak near their bench went amber and then copper, and then began to let its leaves go in the particular, silent way of established trees, one or two at a time, unhurried, as though release were not a loss, but a natural rhythm. Theron walked under it on his way to his afternoon seminar and thought about the word deciduous, which comes from the Latin for falling away, and thought about all the things he had let go in the past year, not in the painful way that loss implies, but in the way of a hand that has been clenched for so long that opening it is both relief and revelation. He was thinking this on a particular Wednesday afternoon when he heard Caspian behind him, catching up on the path, and turned to find him red-cheeked from walking fast, and slightly breathless, and more purely himself than anyone Theron had ever known. "You walk faster than is reasonable," said Caspian, reaching him. "You were late?" said Theron. "I was detained by a first year who had a question about Flaubert that turned out to be about her own life," said Caspian, "which is both the most and least convenient thing about teaching literature." They walked together toward the Humanities building in the copper October light, and at one point their hands were close enough that the backs of their fingers touched, briefly, for 2 or 3 steps, not held. Not quite, just touching. And then the path changed, and they separated slightly for a passing cyclist, and their hands fell apart, and nothing was said about it. But it had happened, and it was real, and it was the kind of thing that was beginning to be real in the spaces between their more deliberate choices. It was on a Thursday in the last week of October that the thing happened that would change everything. They were in the west corridor of the Humanities building after hours. It was nearly 7 in the evening and the building had largely emptied. Only a few graduate students in the library wing and the security desk at the entrance. They had been in Theron's office, working Theron on a translation project he was consulting on, Caspian on his semester assessments, and they had decided to go and get coffee from the machine at the end of the corridor before finishing for the evening. The corridor was dim at that hour, the overhead lights on their evening setting, the only strong light coming from the orange rectangle of the vending area at the far end. They were walking side by side, and Caspian was talking something about a student's essay on Baudelaire, an argument the student had made that was either very good or completely wrong, and Caspian could not decide which, and Theron was listening. And at some point, in the dimness of the corridor, not thinking about it, Caspian took his hand. Just took it. So you take the hand of the person beside you when you are comfortable enough to do it without deciding to. Theron felt his fingers close around Caspian's and the whole familiar warmth of it, and they walked the rest of the corridor like that. And Caspian continued talking about the Baudelaire essay without interruption, and Theron listened and answered, and felt the quiet, ordinary rightness of it, what neither of them knew, in that dim Thursday corridor, was that there was a camera. A new security camera, installed over the summer as part of a broader campus safety initiative, positioned at the junction of the west and south corridors, angled to cover both directions. The footage was on a rolling record 48 hours. Before overwriting and under normal circumstances. Nobody reviewed it unless there was a specific reason. There was a specific reason. 2 weeks later, the email from the Dean of Faculty arrived on a Monday morning, sent simultaneously to both of them, requesting their presence in the Dean's office at 11 o'clock for what the email described, in the specific bloodless phrasing of institutional caution, as a conversation regarding a matter of departmental policy. Theron read it at 7:45, before his first coffee, and felt something cold move through him with the precision of understanding. He did not know yet what the evidence was, but he knew the tone. He had been in universities long enough to know the tone. He texted Caspian, "Have you seen the email?" Caspian's reply was immediate. "Yes. Come to my office." Theron was there in 6 minutes. Caspian was standing at his window with his arms crossed in the way that meant he was containing something. And when Theron came in, he turned and his face was not afraid. Something more complicated than afraid. "I think there's a camera in the west corridor," said Caspian. Theron sat down. "I know," he said. "We held hands," said Caspian, and the plainness of the sentence, the complete insufficiency of it, as a description of anything wrong, was its own kind of grief. "We held hands," confirmed Theron. They looked at each other for a moment. "This institution has a non-fraternization policy," said Caspian. 4 colleagues in the same department." "We are colleagues in the same faculty," said Theron. "Not the same department." "I know," said Caspian. "But someone has decided that the policy applies, or has decided to make it apply." He paused. "Theron, are you? How are you?" Theron looked at him, at his face in the Monday morning light, serious and careful, and, beneath the carefulness, achingly present. "I am not going to apologize for this," he said. "No," said Caspian immediately. "Neither am I. But I am concerned," said Theron, "about what this means, in practical terms." "So am I," said Caspian. "Let's find out what they actually want before we determine the shape of the problem." The dean's office was decorated in the particular style of institutional reassurance: warm woods, framed photographs of campus in different seasons, books arranged for appearance rather than use. Dean Harriet Blundell was a woman of 60 who had navigated 20 years of academic politics with the pragmatic intelligence of someone who understands that every institutional decision is also a social one. She was not unkind. She was, however, constrained by policy, by precedent, by the particular way institutions protect themselves when they feel exposed. She showed them the footage. 40 seconds of a dim corridor, 2 figures in overcoats, walking toward a vending machine, and one of them, Caspian, reaching over and taking the other's hand, and the hands remaining joined for the remainder of the corridor. 40 seconds? Of a hallway. Nothing more and nothing less. She explained the complaint, which had been filed by a junior colleague, Theron recognized, and who he now understood, reasons for a professional rivalry that predated this moment. She explained the policy, which was specific about relationships between faculty members in positions of potential evaluative power over each other, which technically they were not, but which the policy's language was broad enough to encompass. If read uncharitably, she explained that the footage, combined with the complaint, constituted sufficient grounds for a formal review. Caspian, during this explanation, sat with his hands folded on his knees and listened with the complete attention of a person who is refusing to give any external indication of what the listening is costing them. When the dean finished, he said, "Are we being accused of something?" "There is a formal complaint," said Dean Blundell, carefully, "which requires a formal process." "What is the complaint, specifically?" said Caspian. "A violation of the faculty conduct policy regarding personal relationships between colleagues," said the dean, in the tone of someone reading from a document they did not themselves author. "And the associated claim that this relationship has impacted the departmental climate." "In what way?" said Theron. The dean looked at them both. She looked, he thought, tired in the way of someone who dislikes the thing they are required to do. "I want to be clear," she said, "that this office has no position on the personal lives of faculty members. The policy exists for structural reasons, and the complaint has been filed and must be processed." She paused. "I am recommending a period of administrative leave for both of you while the review is conducted. With pay? This is standard procedure." Caspian said nothing. Theron said nothing. The room held the particular silence of three people who all understand that a thing is being decided that none of them fully control. "How long?" said Theron. "The review process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, said the dean. "I would anticipate a resolution before the end of the semester." They left the dean's office together, which was itself, perhaps, a statement. In the corridor outside, Caspian stopped and leaned against the wall, with his head back and his eyes closed for exactly 5 seconds, and Theron stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Then Caspian opened his eyes and said, Well, agreed Theron. "We need to tell our students," said Caspian. "Yes," said Theron. "And clear our offices," said Caspian. "Today, presumably." "Presumably," said Theron. And then, because it seemed essential to say, "I am not sorry." Caspian looked at him. "I know," he said. "Neither am I." He straightened away from the wall. "I'm angry," he said, with the particular precision of someone naming an emotion accurately rather than performing. "It not at you? Not at us? At the shape of the world, I suppose? That 40 seconds of a hallway is sufficient." "It is often sufficient," said Theron. "Historically." "Yes," said Caspian. "Historically." He looked at the corridor, at the doors of offices they would not be entering for the foreseeable future. At the institution they had both built pieces of their lives inside. "Theron," he said. "Yes, whatever happens with the review," said Caspian. "Whatever they decide. I want to be clear that I am not renegotiating anything." Theron looked at him for a long moment. "Neither am I," he said. "The review took 6 weeks and reached a conclusion that was, by institutional standards, a compromise, which is another way of saying that it satisfied nobody. The relationship was deemed to not technically violate the non-fraternization policy as written, because the specific evaluative relationship the policy required was absent. However, the review committee recommended, and the dean concurred, that in light of the departmental climate concerns raised, and in the interest of maintaining professional standards, both faculty members should be formally censured and required to complete a professional conduct review course, and that Caspian's contract, which was his second year on a 3-year renewable, would not be renewed at its conclusion. Theron's position was tenured and could not be terminated without a full process the committee did not want to initiate. His censure was official and on record. He was told, with the particular clarity of institutional subtext, that his position at the university remained, but that his trajectory committee appointments, promotion consideration, departmental standing was unlikely to be unaffected. They were called in separately to receive these outcomes. Theron received his alone, in the same Wormwood office, with a different quality of silence this time. He thanked the dean, which was perhaps the most useless thing he had ever said, and returned to the corridor and stood outside the door of Caspian's office, temporarily vacant. Its nameplate still up, and waited. Caspian came out of the main stairwell 15 minutes later. His face was arranged. Not closed, not performing composure, but arranged the way someone arranges a room before speaking honestly in it, cleared of the extraneous. He saw Theron and walked to him, and they went into the empty office together, and Caspian closed the door. "They are not renewing my contract," he said. "I know," said Theron. "Or I suspected." "It's a 2-year notice," said Caspian. "So I have until the end of my term." He sat on the edge of the desk that had been his desk for 1 year and a few months. "It's a termination with procedural cover," he said. "The procedural cover being that I'm being allowed to complete my term." "Yes," said Theron. "Your tenure means they can't touch your position," said Caspian. "They can touch everything else," said Theron. "My record, my standing, my prospects for the next 20 years in this specific institution." He paused. "I have been considering, since we left the dean's office 6 weeks ago, what I am willing to accept in exchange for what I have." Caspian looked at him and, "Nothing," said Theron. "I am not willing to accept the premise that what I have is something to be managed within institutional tolerance. I am not willing to remain in a position that has made explicit its view of me as a professional liability because of who I love." He said the last word without hesitation, which was itself a form of arrival. "I am considering options." "What options?" said Caspian, carefully. "There are universities in other countries," said Theron, "that do not require this particular calculation. There are cities. There are lives." Caspian was very still. "Are you telling me you're thinking about leaving?" he said. "I am telling you," said Theron, "that I do not want to stay somewhere that has made clear it considers us a problem to be managed. And I am asking you what you want. Because I understand that you have your own history with place and belonging in exile. And I am not proposing anything without knowing what you want." Caspian looked at him for a long time. Outside, the campus continued its afternoon rhythms. Voices, footsteps, the mechanical thud of a distant door. "When I was 26, said Caspian, "I left Lyon because I needed more room than the life I had there could provide. I found more room, and then I built it into a room I was afraid to leave, and when I came here it was partially an accident, and partially not quite courage, more like falling toward the next necessary thing." He paused. "I have never chosen a place because of another person. I'm not asking you to choose a place because of me," said Theron. "No," said Caspian, "but I'm considering it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "Where?" "I have been in contact with a colleague in Lisbon," said Theron. "There is a position there that would suit you better than it suits me, actually comparative literature with a European focus. There is also a secondary position in Russian studies that has been offered to me before and that I declined for reasons I now consider insufficient." He paused. "I am not certain. I wanted to know what you thought before I was certain." Caspian looked at him with an expression that Theron was beginning to know well, the one that appeared when something had moved him and he was deciding whether to show it. He was showing it. "You researched Lisbon?" said Caspian. "I researched several cities," said Theron. Lisbon had the best combination of professional opportunity and personal quality. "What personal quality?" said Caspian. "Light," said Theron. "Lisbon has extraordinary light." And then, because it was true and needed to be said, "and it is far enough from here to be a genuine beginning." Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Theron?" "Yes, I would like to go to Lisbon." Theron exhaled. It was not relief. He had not realized he was holding the breath. It was something more complete than relief. "Then we will go to Lisbon," he said. They resigned their positions in the same week in early December, with the particular care that people who know how institutions work bring to the act of leaving one. Caspian had already been non-renewed. His resignation was almost administrative. Theron's was consequential. 30 years of scholarship, 11 years of tenure, an office that contained the accumulated evidence of a specific intellectual life. He packed it in boxers over 3 afternoons, and on the last afternoon Caspian came and sat in the empty chair across from the empty desk and talked to him while he packed. And the conversation they had was about everything except packing. "Which is the most useful kind? Do you regret it?" Caspian asked. At one point, Theron looked at the last shelf, the row of Russian texts he had spent 30 years building. Some of them annotated in his own hand from his graduate school years, the first editions, the translations, the critical companions. "I regret the circumstances," he said. "I do not regret a single thing that produced them. Even the 40 seconds of corridor footage," said Caspian. "Especially that," said Theron. And he took his hand, briefly, in the empty office, and held it and did not let go. They flew to Lisbon in February. On a gray morning that felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another in the way that actual life rarely achieves. And novels depend on. They had sold what they could, shipped what they could not, surrendered what was not worth taking. Theron's apartment had been 30 years of accumulated careful living, and it had taken 3 weeks to dismantle it, and at the end of the 3 weeks it had been empty in a way that felt not like loss, but like the room finally showing its actual dimensions. Caspian's apartment had been 1 year of expansive chaos and had taken 4 days to pack, and the chaos had been so particular and so entirely Caspian that Theron had found himself laughing while packing it. At the 3rd novel in a language, Caspian did not speak, and the curtain-covered notebook and the collected evidence of a life lived entirely without apology in the departures hall of the airport, waiting for their boarding call. They sat together in the way they had learned to sit together, close but not jammed, comfortable in each other's proximity without requiring to be touching, which was a kind of ease that takes time and trust to build. Around them the airport was doing what airports do, moving people from one version of their lives to another with the impartial efficiency of a mechanism that does not know what it carries, only that it must carry it. Caspian was reading something. Theron was not reading anything, but had a book open on his lap, which was a form of thinking he had practiced his entire life. "What are you thinking about?" said Caspian, without looking up from his own book. "Endings," said Theron. "Of what?" "Of how I described the last chapter of my life," said Theron. "The chapter I believed I was in." He paused. "I am revising my interpretation." Caspian looked up at him. "What's the new interpretation?" "That what I thought was the main narrative was, in fact, an extended prologue," said Theron, "and that the story I was actually living has not yet begun." Caspian looked at him for a moment with that full, undeflected attention that Theron had loved since the first Tuesday morning in the faculty lounge, when he had not yet known it was love. "That is," said Caspian, a remarkably optimistic reading, "for a Russian literature scholar." "I am," said Theron, "in the process of revising my genre." Caspian smiled. Not the quick one, or the social one, or even the slow, private one, a new one. An expression Theron had not catalogued before, which, he thought, might be specific to this precise moment. The look of a person who has arrived. "I love you," said Caspian, in the departures hall, in February, in front of the mechanism that was going to carry them somewhere new. Not quietly. Not with any of the careful modulations they had previously applied to that sentence in public. Spaces. "I love you," said Theron, and he said it in the same register, clear and unmodified, in the way of a person who has decided that the word belongs in the air as much as anywhere else. The boarding call came. They gathered their things and joined the line, and when they reached the gate, Theron discovered that the seats they had been assigned were side by side, which was something he had arranged but not told Caspian, and Caspian discovered this and laughed at the full, real laugh that Theron had first heard in a faculty lounge in January of the previous year and had been, without knowing it, organizing his entire interior life around ever since. Lisbon received them in the way of a city that does not know it is expected to be a beginning and simply continues being itself its own particular light, which was everything Theron had promised and more, a light that seemed to come from inside the white buildings and the blue tiles and the wide river at the foot of the hills as much as from the sky. They had an apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Alfama that was old and impracticable and had 2 rooms, full of windows and a terrace that looked across the rooftops toward the river. And the first morning there, standing on that terrace, with coffee while the city arranged itself into the early light below them, Theron looked at Caspian and felt, with the specificity that only the genuinely astonished feel, that he was in the right place in a way he had not previously known. Right places exist. "Well," said Caspian, looking at the view. "Well," said Theron. "This is where we live," said Caspian. "This is where we live," agreed Theron. Caspian turned from the view and looked at him instead, which Theron had come to understand was something Caspian did, chose people over landscapes, or rather understood people as a kind of landscape, the most specific and least reproducible kind. "Are you happy?" said Caspian, as he had asked on the bridge, in that other city, in that other chapter. "Yes," said Theron. And this time there was no qualification, no careful parsing, no architecture of containment around the word. Just the word, true in every syllable, in the Lisbon morning, with Caspian 3 feet away in the rest of their lives, an open text. Caspian stepped forward and kissed him on the terrace. In the light, with the city spread out below them, and the river catching the sun, and nothing between them, and the air that they had finally arrived into together. It was a long kiss, unhurried, the kind that has decided it is not going anywhere because it is already where it wants to. Bait. And when they stepped apart, Caspian kept his hands on Theron's face for a moment, looking at him, really looking, the full, undeflected attention, the attention that sees rather than observes, and said, "Good morning, Theron." "Good morning, Caspian," said Theron. They went inside and made breakfast in the small, impractical kitchen of the apartment that was now their home, and the morning continued with the unheroic beauty of ordinary mornings between people who loved each other, coffee and bread and the smell of the city coming through the open window, and Caspian reading something in French while Theron washed the cups. And a conversation that started about something small and grew into something large in the way that their conversations always did. and the light moving across the floor as the sun rose over the Alfama rooftops, and all of it, each small ordinary detail of it charged with the quality of something chosen, something arrived at, something worth every winding road that led here. The university positions came through in March. Caspian's first, a senior lectureship in comparative literature at the city's largest university. The kind of appointment that recognized without requiring justification the scope of what he brought to it. His first lecture drew 40 students, and the subsequent word of mouth drew 20 more, which was, for a new faculty member in a new country, extraordinary. Theron's appointment followed 2 weeks later, research professor in Slavic studies, with a remit that suited his specific hybrid of scholarship and translation work better than any position he had held before. The professional world rebuilt itself around them in the way that professional worlds do when you bring genuine work to them. Without reference to the previous version, they did not hide. This was, in Lisbon, almost unremarkably unnecessary. The city had its own history with such things, and the university had its own culture, and their colleagues were, in the main, interested in their scholarship and not especially interested in their private lives, except insofar as they were interesting. People, there were no cameras and dimly lit corridors that mattered here. There was no 40 seconds of footage. There was only the daily fact of 2 people who worked in the same faculty and walked to their offices together in the morning, and had lunch in the courtyard cafe and talked about their students and their research and their life with the ease of people who have stopped performing anything at all. In April 1 year, almost exactly from the night of the bridge in the other city, they hosted a dinner party in the apartment on the hill. 6 people, 3 colleagues from the university, a neighbor who turned out to be a novelist and therefore essential, and a former student of Caspian's who happened to be spending a semester at a Lisbon research institute. It was the first time they had done something so deliberately domestic in a social context, had cooked together in the impractical kitchen, had set the table on the terrace in the April warmth, had welcomed people into the space that was there. Shared life. Caspian made lamb and something with preserved lemons that was entirely unnecessary and completely extraordinary. Theron opened wine with the precise competence of a man who has spent his adult life in academic departments where wine is important and discovered, in this chapter, that it means something different when it is shared rather than managed. The dinner lasted until past midnight. When the last guest left, they stood on the terrace in the dark and looked at the lights of the city below and the river beyond it. And Caspian said, "That was a good evening." "That was a very good evening," said Theron. "We are building something," said Caspian, with the particular tone of a person stating a thing they are slightly surprised to find themselves in possession of. "We are," said Theron. Caspian turned to him. "Theron." "Yes. I want to ask you something," said Caspian, "and I want you to not analyze it before you answer it." "That," said Theron, "is asking a great deal of a Russian literature scholar." "No," said Caspian. "Try anyway." He took a breath. "Do you want this to be the rest of your life? This specific thing? This city? This terrace? This," he gestured between them, "us." Theron looked at him for a moment. At his face in the dark, lit only by the city lights below and the particular quality of southern night sky. At the man who had walked into a faculty lounge 14 months ago with coffee on his collar and demolished, without intending to, the careful architecture of everything Theron thought he understood about himself. "Yes," he said, without analyzing it. "Yes. This is the rest of my life." Caspian exhaled the same kind of exhale as on the bridge, the almost sigh. The thing that is not relief, because relief implies the possibility of disappointment, and what Caspian felt was. Theron understood. something more complete than relief. He reached over and took Theron's hand, as he had in the corridor, as he had in the first days, as he did when he felt like it and the world had finally become a place where feeling like it was enough, and held it, and said, "Good." "Good," agreed Theron below them. The city went on in its own ancient, light-filled life, and the river moved toward the sea, and the terrace held them both in the particular warmth of a Lisbon spring night, and what they had, this thing that had begun in a faculty lounge with spilled coffee and a blood-dry flyer and two people who were both, in different ways, trying not to look was real, and it was theirs, and it was in every way that mattered. The beginning, in the mornings. Theron woke first. This was a habit left over from his previous life, an early riser's discipline. The alarm clock of a man who has always had things to organize before the day begins. The difference, in this life, was that there was no urgency to the waking. He lay in the morning light of the Alfama apartment and listened to Caspian's breathing and looked at the ceiling where the light from the river made moving patterns through the curtains, and found that he was in no hurry at all. He was, he thought, discovering the geometry of contentment, which is not the large dramatic shape he might have imagined in his 50s, but rather this, the morning light, the breathing of the person beside him, the city making its quiet. Early sounds outside the window, the knowledge that the day ahead held things he wanted to do with someone he wanted to do them with. Caspian, when he woke, was immediately present in a way that still occasionally surprised Theron. No groggy gradations, no slow assembly of consciousness, just asleep, and then awake, and immediately himself. He would roll toward Theron with the matter-of-fact affection of a person who has decided that love is an ongoing action rather than a periodic event, and say good morning in the Russian he had learned not from a textbook but from Theron, in the specific, lightly archaic phrasing that Theron used, which meant that Caspian's Russian sounded disconcertingly and beautifully like the Russian of someone who had grown up reading Turgenev. He was doing this deliberately. Theron had accused him of it. Caspian had said that if you were going to learn a language you should learn the best version of it, and Theron had said that the 19th century was perhaps not the most practical model, and Caspian had said that practicality was overrated, and they had argued about this with the comfortable intensity of people who argued because it is a form of pleasure, and the argument had ended, as their arguments generally ended, without a winner and with both of them knowing more than they had before. By summer they had established rhythms that neither of them had consciously designed, and both of them understood as evidence of something working. Saturday mornings at the market in the Ribera, where Caspian chose vegetables with the deliberate attention of someone composing a text, and Theron carried the bags with the accepting resignation of a man who has decided that this particular delegation is perfectly reasonable. Sunday afternoons at the corner table of the cafe near the university, where the proprietor had learned their order and brought it without being asked, which was the specific kind of small recognition that makes a neighborhood feel like belonging. Wednesday evenings at the Fado bar near their building, where the music was old and the room was dark, and the particular quality of longing in the Portuguese songs, the saudade that has no direct equivalent in any language Theron had mastered, mapped, he thought, onto something he finally understood from the inside. Not the longing itself, which he had carried for 30 years as a chronic condition, but the reconciliation with it. The way saudade is not merely grief for what is absent, but love for what has been, and therefore a form of gratitude. He had been grateful, in his way, for his previous life, but this was a different kind of gratitude, the kind you feel when you are exactly where you are supposed to be, rather than grateful for having survived where you were. Caspian published a paper in September, a piece on translation and identity that drew on his experience of living between languages, and cultures with the kind of scholarly authority that comes from genuine personal stake. It was picked up in several places and discussed widely, and the university received letters from other institutions and 2 invitations for visiting lectures, one of which Caspian accepted because it was in Barcelona and he wanted to show Theron. Barcelona, which he did in October, on a long weekend that they approached as a deliberate adventure, and that turned out to be one of those trips where the place exceeds what you expected of it in every particular. Theron fell in love with Barcelona in the way that people who love one city understand how to fall in love with another, not as a replacement but as an extension, and Caspian watched him fall in love with it with the specific pleasure of someone who has given someone else a gift that fits perfectly. On the last evening in Barcelona, they walked along the waterfront in the warm October air, and Caspian said, without particular preamble, "Tell me what you have lost." Not with the weight of something that needs to be processed, but with the lightness of someone who wants to understand the full picture. Theron considered the question as they walked, the harbor lights on the water and the seedy noise behind them, and Caspian's hand warm in his. "A version of my life," he said. "A long one, an established one. The kind of life that other people could see and understand without needing explanation." He paused. "Status, in the institutional sense. A trajectory I had assumed would continue until retirement." "And what have you gained?" said Caspian. "Everything I just described," said Theron, "was built on a foundation that wasn't real. It was built on a version of myself that was partial. A very good partial. Genuinely I had a good life. Genuinely, but partial." He was quiet for a moment. "What I have gained is the whole version, which is incalculably worth the architecture. I demolished to reach it." Caspian stopped walking and turned to him. "When I was 26, he said, someone told me that the life you didn't live follows you like a shadow, and the only way to stop it following you is to turn around and face it." He paused. "I turned around. It took you longer, but you turned." "I had better assistance," said Theron. Caspian laughed, the full, real laugh, and kissed him on the Barcelona waterfront, briefly and entirely, and then they walked back toward the hotel in the warm October night, with their hands still joined in the whole, continuing, unrepeatable specificity of their life together moving around them like light. December in Lisbon is mild and luminous. The city in its Christmas clothes, without the cold that makes northern cities pull inward. They decorated the apartment, Caspian doing most of the decorating, which turned out to be something he did with the same attention he brought to everything, spending an entire Saturday arranging lights on the terrace railing in a pattern that served no function except beauty, and spent the holiday working on their respective projects and cooking together and walking through the decorated city in the evenings with the particular ease of people who have stopped keeping track of where one person ends and the other begins, because the distinction has become academic. On the 31st of December, they were on the terrace at midnight watching the fireworks over the river, and Theron thought about the last year with the specificity of a man who has always read his own life as text. He thought about the faculty lounge in January, which seemed now like a place he had read about rather than inhabited. He thought about the bridge and the corridor in the cold October night of the footage, and the dean's warm wood office, and the boxers in the stripped apartment, and the departures hall in the apartment on the hill, and the market on Saturdays, and the Fado bar on Wednesday evenings, and all of it, the whole long specific arc of it, arriving at this. The river below them, the fireworks above it, Caspian's arm around his shoulders in the December night. "Happy New Year," said Caspian, in Russian, in Theron's Russian. "Happy New Year," said Theron, and turned and kissed him in the Lisbon night while the fireworks made their brief, brilliant marks on the sky above the river, and the city celebrated. Around them, and the year turned into the next one, which was theirs, which was completely and without qualification theirs. There was a moment. Later that night, the fireworks done, the city settling back into itself. The two of them inside now with the terrace door open to the mild December air, when Caspian was reading and Theron was looking at him, as he did sometimes, simply looking, with the unguarded attentiveness of a man who has given up pretending he does not want to look. The lamp beside Caspian's chair made the specific light that Theron had come to associate with evenings in this apartment. Warm in particular and domestic in a way that the word domestic had never meant to Theron before, because the word had always implied someone else's life. Caspian turned a page. He was wearing the old sweater he wore when he was comfortable, the one with the pull at the left cuff, and his reading glasses were slightly askew on his face in the way they always were, and his lips moved faintly with something from the text. And he was the most specific and real and irreplaceable thing Theron had ever had the complete good fortune to find. "You're staring," said Caspian, without looking up. Precisely as he had said it on the first Tuesday morning, in the faculty lounge, with coffee on his collar and a blood-dry flyer on the bulletin board behind him. "I know," said Theron. "Any particular reason?" said Caspian. "The usual one," said Theron. Caspian looked up from his book, over the askew reading glasses, with the slow private smile. "The usual one," he repeated. "Yes," said Theron. "I love you. I was looking at you because I love you, and I find that I am not inclined to stop." Caspian held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the Lisbon night was mild and full of its own deep light, and the river moved in its ancient course toward the sea. And the year ahead was unknown, and therefore possible, and Caspian said, "Good," as he had said it on the terrace in April, with the same completeness, the same arrival, and returned to his book. And Theron returned to looking at him, because he could, because they were home, because the long prologue had finally ended and the story, their story, specific and unshared and entirely real, had, at last, begun.